Positive Women's Network, and the National LGBTQ Task Force. This webinar is in commemoration of National Women and Girls HIV Awareness Day. So I'm very excited to invite you to welcome you all on this webinar. And to start off, we're going to first introduce our speakers and then give a quick intro into the framework of this webinar, and then we'll get started. Please feel free to ask questions through the chat box to your left. I'm happy to welcome our featured speakers today. We've got Cecilia Chung, Senior Strategist of the Transgender Law Center. Cecilia is nationally recognized as an advocate for human rights, social justice, health equity, and LGBTQ equality. She was the former chair of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and is currently serving on the Health Commission. Cecilia has been working tirelessly on the local, national, and international levels to improve access to treatment for transgender people and people living with HIV, to erase stigma and discrimination through education, policy, advocacy, and visibility. We'll also be hearing from Keziah Vaughn. Keziah Vaughn is a trans advocate based out of Monroe County, Georgia. She's the founder of the Whitfield Project Transforming Lives, which provides a safe space for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. And it equips, empowers, and educates individuals, helping to provide avenues where each transgender and gender nonconforming individual is provided with the opportunity to learn self-love, self-acceptance, healthy living, and life skills. She's also has successfully established an investigation business. We'll also be hearing from Kate Diadamo, a long-term advocate for the rights of sex workers and the former national policy advocate at the Sex Workers Project, where she focused on laws, policies, and advocacy, including the criminalization of sex work, anti-trafficking, and HIV-specific laws. Prior to joining the Sex Workers Project, Kate was a community organizer and advocate for people in the sex trade with the Sex Workers Outreach Project and Sex Workers Action New York. In this role, she developed programming to promote community building, provided peer support, and advanced political advocacy to support the rights of people engaged in the sex trade, both on and off the job. And we'll also be hearing from Megan Morey. Megan is the Criminal and Economic Justice Project Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force and Senior Policy Council. She focuses on a broad cross-section of criminal justice issues, including the criminalization of people living with HIV, the experiences of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV in reentry, and the criminalization of poverty. And I will be your moderator today. My name is Sabrina Rewald, and I am the Reproductive Justice Fellow at the National LGBTQ Task Force through the organization If One How. So before we get started, I want to provide a brief overview of reproductive justice, since we are going to be looking through a reproductive justice lens at the topics that our speakers will be delving into deeper today that affect people living with HIV and people who are in general affected by HIV. So reproductive justice is a human rights framework. It centers the fundamental right to sexual health, bodily autonomy, and reproductive self-determination, including the human right to have children, to not have children, and parent the children that we have in safe and healthy environments. So International Women and Girls Day was yesterday, and the National Women and Girls HIV/AIDS Awareness Day is tomorrow. So we thought this was a really perfect time to consider the HIV epidemic through an RJ lens, a reproductive justice lens. This is because we're all working for the right to live our lives with dignity and the right to choose how we use our bodies, without government, employer, or harmful religious intrusion. We have a right to bodily autonomy, to not be criminalized, and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. All of these rights are linked, and all of these rights are impacted by the effects of structural violence, which is the ways in which laws and policies harm individuals on a daily basis. And with that, I will move to Cecilia Chung, our first speaker. Cecilia, take it away. Cecilia, are you there?
Cecilia,
Hi, Cecilia, are you there?
Sorry, folks, technical difficulties, but we'll get it fixed.
So it looks like Cecilia might have dropped off the call. I think she's probably going to call right back in, but do we maybe want to skip ahead and then come back? Hello?
Oh, wait, let's just try one more time. Cecilia, are you there?
There's someone.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I think we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, if you could just speak up a little bit more. It's not coming through super clear.
My volume up. Is it better?
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you again. What you missed me saying earlier when I'm talking to myself was I thank Tammy and Sabrina for inviting me to join this call to really, put, the trans women lens, on the reproductive justice framework. When Tammy and Sabrina asked me to present something around bodily autonomy, this is not necessarily a term that trans community have been using on their own, but in essence, a lot of the gaps, in terms of service and also support has a lot to do with barriers for trans people to make their own medical decisions. So a little bit more about what we do. We are a civil rights organizations. We use advocacy, community organizing, and also impact litigation to help change the landscape of trans rights across the country. And 2 years ago, I launched a project called Coffee to be Trans. And at that project, we further confirmed a lot of our suspicions how trans women living with HIV are accessing their services, and where the gaps potentially are. When we talk about bodily autonomy, we talk about primarily 5 things. So it's the access to treatment and surgery, and a lot of times when we say treatment, it's hormone replacement therapy, and sometimes some of the community members will pursue surgical options as well, to align their body with their gender identity, but some chose not to. And also because, surgeries can be quite invasive, and it's really up to the individual, to make those decisions. However, because these next 2 points, it makes sometimes, making these decisions very difficult. State issue identity documents, which includes birth certificate, driver's license, state issue ID cards, all have different rules in terms of name change and gender change, gender marker change, on these documents. Some states have passed bills to allow for gender marker change on birth certificate, and unfortunately, this is decided on a state-by-state level, and there are states currently are not prohibit. Some of the states are prohibiting people to change their gender marker, and we've heard, community members saying that sometimes judge would not grant them name change either because they said that they were committing fraud. So in terms of coerced sterilization, it becomes a big issue, especially when members of the community try to change their gender marker, and they have to produce like proof that they have gone through, the gender confirmation surgery. For trans women, gender confirmation surgery means basically female inversions, which also involve orgasmy, which is like castration. So, needless to say, once you go through that process, you become sterile. And this is something that other community really don't have to deal with. No other community that we know of requires you to give up your right to your own family planning, or to have your own child. And these are the things that a lot of times we really don't get the options to consider. And then like when we talk about reproductive justice, when we talk about autonomy, we really have to talk about what prevents people from becoming independent and make decisions on their own. And I put poverty here because the surveys that Positively Trans conducted had shown that 43% of our community, trans women of color living with HIV, earn less than $12,000 a year. And and among this population, 41% had also have a history of incarceration, and another 41% have reported that they have gone over 6 months without, seeing a medical provider. And these happens because of, a poor experience with their medical providers. We have heard stories of medical providers withholding community members' hormone prescriptions until they are adhering to the ARV treatment. We also have heard, that's also the case, for some of the other substance dependent community members, that the providers use that as a way to coerce them into drug treatment programs. And the truth to this matter is that we should treat all these separately. That a trans woman should not have to wait for other issues to resolve, to get the hormone to access hormone prescription at all. And from our surveys, we have identified 5 priorities in terms of health concern. And when you look at the order of this, antiretroviral therapy is number 5, when gender affirming and non-discriminatory healthcare is number 1, and hormone therapy and side effects are number 2. I think that this is really important to really reaffirm that autonomy means we get to make our own decisions. We get to prioritize which treatment we want first. And that's something that we need to learn, who see themselves as our partner and not some top-down lecturer who tries to tell us how to live our lives. And sometimes, this is where religion plays a part also. We currently know that there is one trans man who are in legal battle with a Catholic-run hospitals because they refuse to let him have his gender, not gender reassignment surgery. They refuse to let him have his top surgery at that hospital because the administrator said that that's against their religion. So we will see how religious freedom actually will impact it. But as I mentioned this, some of the things that really come to my mind is how women who have their choices limited in terms of their reproductive health and their rights, and these are the same kind of challenges that transgender women face when it comes to making decisions for their own body. So I know that we're going to go into some additional details about, like what the transgender women face. So part of this is, like it's hard to do advocacy work for like better healthcare access when, like the government is displaying really hostile attitude and actively trying to change laws to prohibit pretty much our existence. So in responding to all those changes and threatening bills like the one in North Carolina, we have like created a action center at Transgender Law Center, and that is the short URL that I listed there that you can go and at the action center you will find 3 specific items. First is the legislation tracker map. It is a map with all the updated legislation around anti-trans bills or like or bills that are like harmful to transgender people. The second is policy desk, that actually is a video of our policy staff, Sasha, who discussed the 3 anti-trans bills currently going through the state levels. And also the third one is petitions. We have started a couple of petitions, and it is through the action centers that you can sign on to those petitions, and which I really, really like to encourage you all to like go there and check it out. My presentation is pretty much done here. I think that in terms of like looking at where we are, where transgender justice intersects reproductive justice is, it's really, look at the fluidity of gender and gender identity. Because reproductive justice is not just like an issue that women or trans women face. Trans men who actually have not had the uterus removed, have not had hysterectomy, and they also sometimes have started to think about family planning. But because the way that it's currently set up, sometimes, like the stigmas outweigh, like their desire, like to seek the changes or to ask the questions that they want to ask. Is it possible for them, to get pregnant and have their own child? And, and recently we've already seen quite a few transgender men who actually have been pregnant. And so, like one of the things that we really would like to work with PWN, and which we're going to move forward with, is to like come together and look at creating some language that actually intersects both, like the transgender movement as well as reproductive justice movement. So all will be revealed in due time, and we're still planning, to have our first meeting, to talk about this. So I'm going to end right there, and I want to also apologize in advance that I will have to jump off the call, before the webinar ends. And it's not because I don't love you guys, it's because I actually am in the middle of in director retreat. But this is too important for me to miss. So with that, thank you. And if you want to contact me, it's Cecilia@transgenderlawcenter.org.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was an incredible presentation. And again, that's Cecilia@transgenderlawcenter.org. And we can send those out in the comment box at the end of the presentation. So again, thanks, Cecilia. And we can move on now to Kate Diadamo.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Kate.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and talk about HIV criminalization and sex work, which is sex worker rights has been my focus. But I always like to contextualize this in a couple different ways. First off, when I talk about policing and criminalization, it's really specific to prostitution laws, loitering for the purposes of prostitution laws, but it's really important to understand that those laws are contextualized within a background of broken windows theory policing of low-level crimes, and have a lot of similar impacts about how they're going to affect the lives and the well-being and the health of folks for whom that policing is a very real part of their existence. And then the second way that I always like to talk about this, especially when we're talking about the intersections of HIV and sex work, is that, the experience of sex work is often really viewed exclusively through a public health lens, and it lends itself to seeing sex workers as, quote unquote, kind of vectors of disease. And it's really important to make sure to recognize that sex work is not only a larger experience than just kind of, the traditional assumptions about what sex is for a sex worker, but, it is a larger and much more complicated facet of people's lives and experience that folks are having. And so while this is what we're talking about today, but it's also really necessary to look at sex work through a lot of different frameworks, and especially when you're a service provider or when you're providing support and allyship to the sex worker community, to make sure it's not simply a conversation about public health and that's where it ends, or even that the conversations about health and well-being extend beyond HIV and AIDS. The history of a lot of this work has been through that lens. And so, while it's really important and while it needs to be discussed, it's not the only way to talk about any of these issues. So I just kind of like to foreground a lot of my comments with that. But today what we're going to be talking about are three kind of different intersections of this space. The first being HIV criminalization, which is building off of laws that specifically target people's HIV status. The second is talking about the impact of sex work and policing. The third is stigma and what that does for service provision and the medical needs of sex workers. But if I could get you to walk away with anything today, it's this quote right here. It's a decriminalization of sex work could reduce HIV rates 33 to 46% over the next decade. And so, the crux of a lot of this is, for me, how does the criminalization of sex work, as opposed to sex work itself, impact people's vulnerability to HIV? I think it's really important that we talk about, different populations as not necessarily at-risk populations, but populations who are put at risk by very specific factors. And here today, we're going to be really talking about criminalization. So what HIV criminalization is usually focused on is people's HIV status. And the way it gets talked about the most in the media is about, when you're having sex with someone, making sure to disclose HIV status and not disclosing that being criminalized, which it gets a lot of conversation. And it's a really important set of laws that are being tackled by a number of different projects, including PWN. And so I definitely want to lift up the bill that they're working on in California at the end. But the way that this specifically impacts sex workers and really disproportionately impacts sex workers, a study that recently came out looked at California in particular and who is being impacted by HIV status-specific crimes, and 95% of those were people who are trading sex at the time. And if you look at other states, that breakdown is not too far off from that. And so the two different pieces that we're looking at is primarily felony upgrades to prostitution-related statutes. So you are arrested for prostitution or for loitering for the purposes of prostitution. And if you are found to be HIV positive and you knew you were HIV positive at the time, it gets upgraded to a felony. And what that means is that in a lot of different, 14 different states and the state of Guam, or in the territory of Guam, people are arrested for very traditional loitering crimes. And loitering for the purposes of prostitution is exactly what it sounds like. It's very often low-level street-based policing, where an officer will see something that they consider an indicator of that person's intent to engage in prostitution and make a lot of assumptions about what that person is there to do. So it's everything from waving down cars, it's the way a person's dressed. It's very often known as walking while trans, and especially for trans women of color who live in specific areas that might have higher rates of street-based prostitution or more arrests for street-based prostitution. That's enough to really warrant an arrest and a conviction. And so I bring up Tennessee because there's been some research in Tennessee about how this breaks down. And I believe it was about 2/3 of those arrested and charged with an HIV-related crime were trading sex at the time. And because so many of those were talking about loitering as the base charge, and then that person having their HIV status, which meant you knew your HIV status. So that could be evidenced by anything from carrying antiretrovirals to having been arrested before and tested for HIV while you were in the system. That meant that it took what was traditionally a misdemeanor and turned it into a felony with an average of 3 to 5 years in prison. And then once that person was released, having to be on the highest level of sex offender registry for the rest of their lives. And so I mentioned Tennessee also because about 2 years ago, there was one win at the legislative level where they were able to take off the provision that said you were required to register as a sex offender, but the felony upgrade still stands. And so, especially if you're someone who's involved in HIV criminalization movements or repealing the laws of HIV criminalization movements, it's really important to remember that the people who are disproportionately impacted by this are folks who are trading sex at the time. And when those laws come off the books, as they have in California, to be able to include those statutes as well. The second way that this gets played out is, and I've unfortunately lost the visuals on my screen, so I'm just going to keep talking. And if one of the other presenters, if I switch to another topic, please hit forward on the slide for me. But the second way that this gets played out is no problem. Mandatory HIV testing when someone's arrested for a prostitution or a prostitution-related crime. So not simply prostitution or loitering warrants an HIV test, but things like purchasing or soliciting, anything related. And I bring up Nevada specifically because there's been a trend to increase this and to work really intimately with the local Department of Health to institute this. And so what happens in specifically Reno, Nevada was one of the places where they did this, but they basically set up a John sting where they had someone who was standing out and pretending to be a sex worker and leaning into cars and trying to negotiate that. And that person was then arrested for soliciting or patronizing a prostitute. That person, it was a ticketable offense at the time, that person was then rapid HIV tested in their car. And what happens, and the other part of this that's really important, is that all of a sudden when your HIV test is attached to a crime, it's outside of traditional HIPAA protections. And so the ability of people to access confidentiality for their HIV status is dramatically reduced. And so in different parts of the country, this is played out in a lot of different ways. With that, it goes into your file. The arresting officer knows, the prosecutor knows, your defense attorney knows, you now know, and in other places they'll do things like read them in open court. And so, one of those additional kind of conflicting pieces is really that it breaks down confidentiality when we attach HIV status to a person's criminal record. The next thing that I like to talk, that I think is really important to talk about, is not just the crime of sex work, but the policing of sex work, which is kind of the other and really important part, and it impacts a lot of different folks. And so one of the ways in which policing of sex work really does have an impact on someone's HIV status or vulnerability to transmission is what we use as evidence of prostitution is all of a sudden a criminalized act. And so what that means and what it meant in New York City and has meant across the country in a lot of different spaces is that possession of condoms is used against folks as evidence that they're about to engage in prostitution. In New York City several years ago, it got so bad that NYPD was regularly harassing outreach workers, where people were refusing to take condoms from outreach workers, where people were avoiding outreach workers, and engaging in prostitution, saying things like, I have 3 condoms on me, and that's the legal limit, right? And so regardless of whether or not they were engaging in prostitution, people felt uncomfortable carrying or taking condoms. And when it's, 3 o'clock in the morning in an area that's a little bit far off from your local Duane Reade, all of a sudden having access to that or having to rely on a client for that means that you're more likely to engage in unprotected sex. And so about 5 years ago, a number of different organizations banded together and started doing some really serious research on this. And I have some information at the end about different resources in particular to this campaign. But attempted to pass a bill banning the use of condoms as evidence. And through a number of different tactics, including negotiating with local district attorneys, negotiating with local police departments, and really trying to make sure that this issue was highlighted as one of a serious public health threat, we were able to get a number of bans. And so that practice is not officially banned as completely as we would like, but has been significantly reduced over the last several years. And other jurisdictions, such as D.C. and San Francisco, have been able to get some of those wins as well. The other piece about policing that is really important is that anytime policing is impacting folks' lives, it's going to have a demonstrable effect on behavior. And so when you think about how sex work is traditionally policed, you think about things like, police sweeps or just a higher police presence in certain areas. And what that means is a couple different things about people's vulnerabilities. It means, first and foremost, that folks are going into more isolated areas, trying to go to areas that don't have as high a police presence. That means people are more isolated from each other and peer networks. They're more isolated from outreach workers. They're more isolated just in general. And so what that means is an increase in interpersonal violence, both from potential clients, but also from police officers who get to operate with impunity. The second is that anytime that there is a higher police presence, what happens is your negotiation time goes down. When you know that someone is out there looking for you, looking for what looks like someone engaging in sex work, looking for an interaction of two people who might be negotiating that, the amount of time that you are willing to spend and put yourself at risk in that space goes down significantly. And so there's been an incredible amount of research on what happens when policing of space goes up. And one of the most important things is that negotiation times for things like condom use, for everything from what your boundaries are to what's about to happen, goes down significantly. And so in spaces where policing has gone up, they've been able to track what happens. And what happens is, where condom use was previously something that was a default in those spaces, all of a sudden it became something to negotiate for, and the ability for people to demand condoms went down significantly. And so it's not simply the interactions, it's not simply the criminalization, it's just the police presence when people are interacting with each other in a criminalized way. The last thing I want to talk about is access to service provision. And one of the main barriers to accessing services when you're engaged in the sex trade is just straight up stigma. Being able to disclose that and feel safe disclosing that, knowing first and foremost that no one's going to call the cops, but also that there's not going to be a lot of assumptions made about what healthcare you need and what healthcare you're looking for. Working in the sex industry looks a lot of different ways. It's a constellation of experience for everyone involved. And so one of the things that is most highly reported, and this was something that there was an organization that I helped co-found called Persist Health Project, and the first thing we did was survey people engaged in the sex trade in the New York metropolitan area and say, are you accessing services? Are you disclosing? Why are you not accessing services? You're not. And one of the main things came out was, I don't feel comfortable talking to my provider. I'm afraid what they're going to say, and I'm afraid of how I'll be treated afterwards. And a lot of them had previously negative experiences where they were required to have a psych eval after that. They were asked to disclose significantly more personal information that was really not relevant to what they needed and what they were there for. To making assumptions about how often they should be being tested, what that testing should include. And very often, it really was limited by the fact that they were only viewed as vectors of disease specifically for HIV. And there's a really amazing resource out there called the St. James Infirmary. It's based in San Francisco, California, and they work with sex workers, and they work exclusively with sex workers and have their entire time, and have actually done a lot of research on the needs of their community. And so when we look at the medical needs, very often it's sexually transmitted infections and HIV that gets highlighted. But there were two things that people identified as actually the most important areas of healthcare needs, or the things that were most significantly impacting their health. The first was the incredible emotional and mental weight of living a dichotomous life. So feeling like they had to be lying to everyone in their life was really the thing that people identified as having the most impact. It led them to feel isolated, it led them to feel depressed, and it led them less likely to seek out services and to seek out complete services because they felt like they had to bifurcate their identity. The second was, and this is really unsurprising, some of the most basic things. If you look at sex work as a job, they were very traditional occupational health and safety needs. And so for dancers, it was a lot about knees and ankles being treated. And there was a lot of carpal tunnel syndrome for people like massage workers and body workers who worked predominantly with their hands. For things that required more physical exertion, so like pro-doming, it was a lot more of really basic shoulder and wrist injuries. And so I think the most important thing is to really think about the way that stigma is is playing out in people's lives in service provision. And second, to look at it as a job and to look at it as a form of really physical labor oftentimes. And, once that barrier is conquered, a lot of the other medical needs make a lot more sense. And then these are just 3 resources that if you want to dig in deeper specifically on HIV, these are really amazing places to start. The first is The Lancet, which is a great journal. It's a medical public health journal. In 2015, released a series of pieces that really looked at criminalization and its impact on HIV. The second is several years ago, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law looked at sex work, HIV, and different types of legalization structures and how those played out. And shockingly, decriminalization was, I believe, quote, the happiest and healthiest sex industry in the world. And then the third, Sex Workers at Risk, is specifically talking about the use of condoms as evidence. And it didn't just look at New York City, where a lot of this dialogue started. It looked both nationally and internationally at the practice and found how common it was and really dug into its impact on people's lives. And so I'm going to stop right there. And thank you guys so much for your time. And I really look forward to your questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Is there any contact information that might be available for folks to connect with you? And we can put that into the chat box a little bit later.
Yes. I am just transitioning jobs and my new email is not set up yet. So the best way to contact me is actually my personal email. It's kmdadamo@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So now we'll move on to Keziah Vaughn, founder of the Whitfield Project. Keziah, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think you're a little bit muffled.
Okay, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to speak briefly in regards to the community, transgender community issues, individuals and sex workers, and the violence placed upon the transgender community. The transgender community issues, basically, it's our constitutional right of the pursuit of happiness to be transgender, LGBT, who you are. It's just constitutional right of the pursuit of happiness. Transgender community, we face legal gender recognition, health and cultural competency. We suffer from violence and hate crime, discrimination, stigma and backlash, children and families, trans health, general health, equality, rights to privacy, and intimidate partner violence. And the transgender individuals in sex work, we suffer with livelihood, enjoyment, temporary career barriers, rape, entrepreneurs, and it's normal due to bullying, finances, networking purposes, relationships, discrimination in workplaces, and lack of faith in itself. So, it's several different things that we go through, and as transgender individuals, and what makes us do sex work. And the violence placed upon the transgender community, the sexual violence has been found to be even the higher in some subpopulations within the community, the transgender community, including the transgender youth, transgender people of color, individuals living with disabilities, homelessness, individuals, and those who are involved in sex trade. 12% of the transgender youth report being sexually assaulted in K through 12 settings. by peers or educated staff. 13% of African American transgender people surveyed were sexually assaulted in the workplace. 22% of homeless transgender individuals were assaulted while staying in shelters. Hate crimes are more prevalent against people of color. In 2009, 53% of LGBTQ hate crime victims were people of color. Of the 22 anti-LGBTQ hate crime murders documented by NCAVP, 79% of the victims were people of color. 50%, 11 individuals of the 2009 murders were transgender women. Of those of 9 were people of color. 82% of the 82% of the other 11 murders of gender non-conforming people. 40% were 45% were people of color. In the numbers, the statistics documented transgender people experience of sexual violence indicate shockingly high levels of sexual abuse and assault. 1 in 2 transgender individuals are sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their lives. Some report estimate that the transgender survivors may experience rates of sexual assault up to 66%, often coupled with physical assault or abuse. This indicates that the majority of the transgender individuals are living with the aftermath of trauma and fear of possible repeat victimization. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out to let me be a part of this journey. As being a transgender woman, one thing that I can really help and educate and promote and help my sisters is I feel like if we all can come together as one and advocate the city planners to stop the segregation and the oppression and the depression and the segregation that's placed upon our communities, I feel as if I know that we will come through as one. And I would like to thank everybody for their time, and I would like to thank the task force and the PWN, accompanied by the participants and the panelists for allowing me to be a part of this journey. Once again, my name is Keziah Imani Vaughn. I'm the founder of the Whitfield Project Transforming Lives. My contact number is 706-424-6929, or you can reach me via email, zaya.vaughn615@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keziah. And what we can do is put her email back in the text box so that folks can write that down again. But thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful information. And now we'll move on to Megan Morey from the National LGBTQ Task Force.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. And I'm sorry that y'all are stuck looking at that terrible picture of me instead of beautiful slides, which I could have provided you instead. But I'm going to just talk real quick a little bit about just to expand on the HIV criminalization piece that Kate spoke up about earlier, and talk a little bit about how, like, other ways that people living with HIV, and especially trans folks living with HIV, are sort of brought into the criminal legal system. So I think to ground that, and Kate, you did a great job talking about this from the sex work perspective, and I think, everybody talked a lot about how, the disparities in outcomes especially for trans folks. But with all criminal law, really we're talking about decisions by people in power about what kind of behaviors we're gonna think are sort of okay, and what kind of behaviors we think deserve to be punished, right? And HIV, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression are all statuses and identities that have historically been criminalized in a whole ton of ways, and all of those are coming to a head in really specific ways right now. And so actually are pregnancy and drug use and other sorts of behaviors that are more common in the LGBTQ community. With HIV in particular, over the last 20 years, there have been an increase in laws that specifically criminalize like the status of having HIV. So they criminalize having sex without disclosing your HIV status to your partner. They criminalize activities like biting or spitting on someone that carry no risk at all of transmission. And they criminalize sexual activity without disclosure, even if that sexual activity has no risk of transmission. So if you use a condom or you're on a treatment regimen that reduces your viral load to zero, there's still no sort of like mitigation of any of those laws, because those laws are put in place not because that behavior is wrong, but because that behavior is stigmatized, and the criminal legal system is looking for a way to put people in jail, and they're using these HIV criminal laws to do that. And a lot of the attention that you've probably seen in the media, like Kate said, is on these like HIV-specific criminal laws that criminalize, non-disclosure or these other activities and behaviors. But as Kate mentioned, there are a bunch of criminal laws that are impacting folks that are in this same vein, but are not necessarily what gets like media attention, right? So Kate talked about one, which is the criminalization of sex work and the felony upgrades that are put on to folks who are engaged in the sex trade that are also living with HIV. But we also know that there's a whole nother kind of sling of HIV-specific laws, and then a bunch of laws that are just impacting folks who are living with HIV. So another one I wanted to talk about is if you are a person who uses injection drugs, whatever those injection drugs are, you are likely to use, syringes to inject those drugs. And if those injection drugs are not prescription injection drugs, then those syringes may not be prescription syringes, and you can be criminalized just for possession of those syringes. That means that folks who are using street drugs like heroin and are using syringes for those are criminalized. And just like Kate was talking about with condom access, if syringes are criminalized, then people have an incentive to not seek access to sterile syringes, have incentive to share syringes with friends, and therefore have like an incentive to engage in behavior that increases their transmission risk of HIV and other STIs. When I was a young person, I was addicted to heroin, and I can tell you from firsthand experience that was absolutely 100% exactly how it happened, right? Like we knew that if we went out to purchase syringes, that carried an increased risk of being arrested. So we just didn't do it. We used syringes forever until they were cutting up our skin, which causes like increased risk of abscesses and other medical health problems. And we shared syringes like it was nothing because we just didn't really have another choice. And it always made me laugh that folks were like, oh, if you make access to syringes more easy, then folks will be more likely to do drugs. And let me just promise you right now, there was no time I was going to quit drugs because I didn't have access to a syringe, right? Like that was not something that was going to happen. Not having access to syringe definitely increased transmission risk in my own community. So I saw firsthand how that happened. And it's that piece of the criminalization is continuing to criminalize people today. There is more access across the country to syringes and syringe services, but still kind of a huge problem. And the same sort of parallel thing as the criminalization of sex work is doing to people's access to condoms and willingness to carry them around, the criminalization of syringes is doing for folks who use drugs, including trans folks who may not have access to health care, as the earlier speakers talked about. We know that in some cities, up to 75% of trans folks end up using street hormones, like non-prescription hormones at some point or another, and most of them are using syringes that they've purchased that aren't prescription as well. So they're subject to those same criminal laws for syringe use as well. So I just wanted to bring that sort of piece into the conversation. But it's already 6:54, and I wanted to leave time for questions. So I'll turn it back over to Sabrina so she can facilitate that.
Thanks so much, Megan. Really appreciate that input. I think it's a really critical part to just the perspective on structural violence and how it impacts the HIV epidemic. And thank you to all of the speakers so much. All of your input has been so enlightening, and I think, I think that what we can do next is go to a question period. So we do have this webinar open till 7:30, but we're going to keep the question period open for about 15 minutes. So please ask away. And I guess if we don't get any questions over a period of time, then we might cut it a bit shorter. But please ask away in the chat box. We might be able to unmute ourselves. I think Cami might be able to give us more information on that. If you want to just, instead of typing your question, you can actually speak it. For example, if you're just listening on the phone. Cami, do you have any input on that specific question?
No, I'm going to go ahead and open the line. And
all attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Right. So if you press *6, you should be able to unmute yourself to ask the question. But since we do have quite a few people online, just try to make sure that you mute yourself if you're not talking.
Awesome. So we have one comment. This isn't a question as much as a comment. I live in North Carolina. I'm terrified about what will the impact of HB2 and the new bill that they are putting in place will have on the LGBTQ community. And so I'm wondering if any of our panelists have any input on that, and I might jump in on the conversation a bit as well. So any thoughts, guys? And to give some overview, so HB2 is otherwise known as a bathroom bill. So it's essentially a piece of legislation that was passed and that there are currently efforts to actually undo its effects, but not as successful as people had hoped. Essentially saying that folks, it's an anti-trans bill saying that folks have to use the washroom that corresponds with their sex at birth and not the gender that they identify with. And so it's incredibly discriminatory towards the transgender community and has, and I think that the impact would be highly detrimental to the LGBT community. The task force is doing a lot of advocacy against HB2 to get it repealed. But what HB2 also does, it prevents local governments from putting in place non-discrimination provisions. So it basically undoes any non-discrimination provision done by a county government, for example, which is in itself undermining local governments and is kind of a really harsh reality of HB2. There are other impacts of HB2 on employment laws, which I'm not as familiar with, but those are the two highlights that I definitely want to raise up. And I don't know if anyone else on the call has any input on that.
Yeah, this is Megan. I think one piece that I just want to so Sabrina's last comment about there being other provisions of the bill I think is really crucial. So the first page was this bathroom bill, and then all the rest of the pages were stripping other rights away from people in the community, including these like employment protections for other protected classes under the state's non-discrimination provisions, workplace. There was a ton of workplace pieces, and I see that Preston Van Vliet's on here, so if you want to talk about those workplace provisions, I would love that. But I think another piece around the bathroom bills that I have heard less about, and I would love the other folks to talk about this too, is that these bills, they're stigmatizing for everyone, they're an affront for everyone, but their biggest impact is on low-income folks, and particularly low-income trans trans and gender nonconforming people of color. If you look at the statistics, you see that folks who are both gender nonconforming and trans, and folks who are cis and gender nonconforming are facing like hugely disproportionate amounts of violence in public spaces. And that's not just because of their gender nonconformity, it's also because of their poverty or just because they're trans, but because people who are lower income have more need to be using those public spaces than people who are wealthy, right? You tell a wealthy person they can't use the public restroom, they go home and use their own, or they use, the one at the fancy restaurant next door. But lower income folks, and particularly people who are experiencing homelessness or other kind of poverty that puts them in public spaces in an almost constant amount of time, I think for those folks, those bathroom bills are just it's not just a question of whether or not you can use a bathroom when you want to. It's about a question of whether or not you can use a bathroom at all. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're thinking about HB2 in that context as well.
Do any of the other speakers want to provide some input on that? Or Preston, if you are on the line, please unmute yourself and jump into the conversation.
Yes, this is Keziah, and I wanted to jump in on the conversation in regards to the HB2 bill. And I would just like to tell my community the only thing that we can possibly do is to be a voice and to be a face and to speak up and to speak out, advocate, and call the city planners, call your legislators, call your senators, and just actually just be a part, show your face. And it just destroyed my heart to read different articles about like in Texas they have the governor up there push for if a transgender student use the opposite sex, with a born at sex bathroom, that the student could file a $2,500 in regards to destruction because of emotional depression. And it's just like it just breaks my heart. So one thing that I could say is to violence is not the key, to just advocate and to continue to be who you are, because this is a civil it's a civil conflict. And it's at the point where they're violating our constitutional rights of the pursuit of happiness. And it's just I feel like if we get together and we get a system, or get something together in regards to pushing towards a civil act towards all this conflict that we get. And how you gonna take our God's given breath and tell us that due to how you feel because of this man-made Christianity. And it's just I just stand together as a community. And we done been through it once before, our community and things of that nature. So, we are, in some religions, we are gods and queens. So, you have to embrace your inner self and, push and advocate and build a concrete. We have to build something concrete that we can stand on as entrepreneurs. And, we have to build something that, is non-breakable, due to, myself. I'm a private detective, so I'm building my concrete so that when things like this happen, we'll have somebody in our community to be able to stand up and to face the laws and things of that nature, because we can't do what they want us to do, which is give in and give up. You can't. We just can't. And so I just say we're all one. So let's just advocate and let them know that, we are equal. there is equality. So we just, one day, hopefully, I'll be president. Let's get to
We'll all be standing behind you.
I think that's so true. Thank you so much, Keziah, for that input. We've got another question. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump onto that question really quickly, or should we move on to the next one? I think there are a few other questions.
Oh my gosh, there's so many questions.
Oh, fantastic. So we've got Preston here saying, I'm in a loud coffee shop, but if you want more info about the worker-related HB2 problems, email me at lgbtqorganizing@gmail.com or call me at 734-891-0501.
Awesome. Always another resource out there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we're going to just jump to a question that Preston asked earlier, which I think is really awesome. What are the typical experiences of sex workers who are incarcerated in accessing both HIV treatment and Hep C treatment in jails and prisons? So I'll give that to
This is Kate.
Great. Hi,
So I would say that, for sex workers, especially if you're talking about people who are arrested under prostitution and loitering specifically, that's really going to, first off, have a lot to do with where they're incarcerated, how they're incarcerated, and what that looks like in every state. It could be something like, for loitering, they're in for the night, they're processed the next day, and they're out, and so they don't actually spend a huge amount of time in jail. Or it can be, a state like Arizona where, or this actually might not be on the books anymore, but where, your third prostitution arrest is a felony and it's a mandatory 1-year sentence in jail. And so I think that is going to be different. Those are also state-based crimes as opposed to federal, which is different around, which has different provisions around what kind of access folks are getting. But for a lot, if we're just talking about prostitution and loitering, you're talking about offenses that have a really huge range as far as how long they're going to be held for and where they're going to be held and what that is going to look like. And so I'm actually going to pass this. I'm lucky enough to work with Megan a lot, and so I'm actually going to pass this question to Megan, who can speak a lot more. Sorry to put you on the spot about people getting access once they are incarcerated for longer periods of time, and also on levels that aren't necessarily like the county jail.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you're totally right. It's such a range, and each facility is a little bit different. And interestingly, we've actually seen in a lot of studies that folks who are incarcerated actually have a higher adherence rate to HIV treatment than people who aren't incarcerated sometimes, because there's sort of a regularized system once you are housed somewhere that around access to medical care. That is not everywhere, by the way. It's just in some places. But we do see really big problems both when people are in lockup around so when you're in lockup, it's like you get arrested, you're in lockup for a few days before your hearings or whatever. And in lockup, it's often really difficult to get any access to any medical care. In some places, you can only be in lockup for 12 to 24 hours. In other places, you may be in lockup for days. And even short gaps in your treatment for HIV can have really outsized effects on your physical health outcomes. So that can be actually a much bigger problem than it maybe sounds like from just thinking about like a few days gap in care. But a few days gap in care can really have like big outsized consequences. And then when people are in facilities for a really short time, sometimes like the medical care just doesn't kind of catch up with them in the facility. Like their medical records aren't transferred over quickly enough, or they're not getting access to the doctor quickly enough to like start the treatment. So again, there may be a gap early in care. But then another big place we see problems are when people are released from incarceration, because they're not released with access to any care. There's usually there can be a long gap between when you're released from incarceration and when you get on Medicaid or Medicare or other insurance. And there can be a gap before you're able to get access to a care provider. And so we see long gaps at the end of a period of incarceration as well. And again, even a short gap can have big consequences on your health outcomes. So I know that wasn't sex work specific, but hopefully it was still helpful.
No, I think it's really thank you so much for taking that, Megan. And then the other piece I wanted to say is just, the challenges around accessing the continuum of care that you really need to be able to successfully fight HIV is really impacted when you do have a record, and especially because, so many, if you're just arrested for prostitution, and you're let out in the same night and you're arraigned and you don't have to spend any time in jail, there's a lot of places where that means you're going to be kicked out of your housing. You're going to lose access to housing benefits if you were on any kind of housing programs. And the collateral damage that really impacts your life, it can be huge. And being able to find a doctor in your local area where you can stay in that local area all of a sudden has been has really significant impacts, and especially on states where some of those carry also the challenges around sex offender registries that determine where you can and can't live and where you can and can't access medical care, also have really significant challenges to being able to, even upon release, even if you haven't been in that long, just kind of tacking on to what Megan said, those kind of collateral damages are all really impactful as far as your ability to get and stay in care.
Yeah, and I know this wasn't part of the question, but all of the things we just said about HIV also apply to transition-related care, except there's the added kind of layer of some facilities make you go through like a certain amount of mental health care treatment before you can get access to any physical transition-related care. And it's often just really hard to get access to mental health care treatment in facilities, period. Like there aren't mental health care service providers in a lot of facilities, although at the federal level they exist, but still it's hard to get access to them. So then that can put, like if you're not already on a transition-related care regimen when you enter a facility, it can be really, really hard to get on one. And even if you are on one when you come in, all those things that we just talked about HIV-related care are, apply across the board. And then same with the things that we talked about release. You may have access to care while you're in the incarceration, but because of how health insurance works, it may be a period of time before you can get access to transition-related care after release. And similarly, those gaps in care for transition-related services can have really, really big, long-term, outsized consequences on folks.
Thank you so much, Kate and Megan. That was incredibly helpful. And I just want to go to, and I want to also just thank Cassandra Barnard for the first question about HB2, and we're just going to jump to Carrie O'Neill's question. Carrie asked, you provided a great definition of structural violence early on in the webinar, and I didn't get to write it down. Can you define it again? And so what I believe I said at the beginning of the webinar was structural violence is the ways in which laws and policies harm individuals' lives on a systemic basis. So that can happen through, just to elaborate on that, which I think was the definition I gave. I'm not really sure, I can't remember, but I think so. That's how it happens in my mind. But that can happen through law enforcement. It can happen as the presenters on this incredible panel have been already discussing, but through law enforcement, through laws themselves that criminalize folks, because being imprisoned in itself is harm to the individual. So that in itself, like a law that criminalizes someone for human behavior is in itself a form of violence. Policies or social structures that prevent a person from being able to access health care, again, a form of harm to that individual since they're not able to access the care that they need to become well and might even put them at risk of death. That is as well a form of violence, as well as just racism and homophobia and transphobia and classism, ableism that's embedded within our systems that put people more at risk of bodily harm even from an individual, but when that's embedded in the laws and policies that we live through and is a part of the institutions that we as humans who are in these societies that we have created have to pass through. So to expect that parts of our society will be exempt or will be excluded from these institutions or not allowed or not permitted or not treated equally is ludicrous and really harmful to society as a whole. So there's the extended version. And I'm wondering whether anyone else has any questions. And Carrie, if you have any other questions, please feel free to chime in. Is there anyone else who might have a question that they don't want to type and maybe want to just ask it verbally? I don't think we have anyone else on the line. And before I let everyone go from this webinar, I want to highlight something that the Positive Women's Network published last year, which is a report on women-centered care. I'm going to put the link now in the chat box. And it's available on PWN's website, but it is a survey of 180 women living with HIV in 7 geographic regions to find out what was working, what wasn't, and which services will help women stay in care. So we didn't really get to tap into the reproductive health and healthcare specific to women as well as trans women, not in a very, very specific frame. So as an additional resource, I wanted to highlight that report because I think it's incredibly valuable. And PWN did incredible work on this report, and so I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a really wonderful resource, and there's a full report, there's a short version, and there's also fact sheets that are available. And while you're at it, definitely check out the rest of PWN's website. Also check out the task force's website if you're so inclined. PWN has some pretty phenomenal resources that actually give more in-depth or a fact sheet information on more of these intersections with HIV that are so critical to think about today on National Women and Girls HIV/AIDS Awareness Day, which is actually tomorrow. So we've got, oh, there we go. So Cami just posted another link. The new bodily autonomy framework that was released today. So that's really exciting. Yay. I want to thank all of the panelists so much. This was an incredible discussion. So I've just put my email address up there. If you have any questions or if you'd like to comment on this webinar, please don't hesitate to email me. And actually, I also want to put Cecilia's email up here again, or just read it out to everyone again. So Cecilia's email is Cecilia, CECILIA, @transgenderlawcenter.org. And Kate's is KMDADAMO@gmail.com. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And Keziah's, I'm just going to go back to Keziah's slide really quickly, and it's there at zaya.vaughn615@gmail.com. So again, I want to thank everyone so much for coming to this webinar. I want to thank Cami so much for her invaluable help in setting this up, and PWN in general for incredible partners. Thank you so much. There will be a recording of this webinar that will be available in the next few days. So I know that was a question that showed up in the chat box, and we will do our best to get that out to everyone. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keziah. Bye.
Oh my God, I not think.
Thank you.